welcome to Thriving with Aspergers. My name is Leslie Pickett and I have Asperger's syndrome. I'm also mother to a child with Asperger's syndrome who is now also thriving on the spectrum, and I'm also a certified master hypnotherapist, and my program is largely born out of my work with hypnosis and neurolinguistic programming and discovering how we could manage the symptoms and behaviors that are typically identified as Asperger's syndrome. Let's be clear about this. It is not a disease. It is not an illness. There's nothing to be fixed or cured. There are, however, quite a number of behaviors and symptoms that people interpret, often incorrectly, and try to manage. And the problem is that when we're managing the behaviors, we're not really getting underneath of them to the cause of the behavior. And as it turns out, there's really only one primary cause for all of the behaviors that we observe in Asperger's, in children with Asperger's and adults with Asperger's as well. And the first and most important thing that any parent or partner or any person living with someone on the spectrum needs to understand is that everything is driven by a state of chronic sensory overload. What does that mean? Well, in practical terms, it means that fluorescent lights, any bright lights, noises, movement, lots of thoughts, lots of internal signals, external signals, all kinds of information are beating us up in a way that neurotypical people don't experience, or at least I think that they do experience it, but not to the degree that we do. There is a psychologist whose name escapes me at the moment. I'll look it up for you and give it to you in another video. But he is based in the Netherlands, I believe. And he has actually developed a software program that he uses to identify Asperger's in children as young as 6 months old. And his software works simply by tracking eye movements for 2 minutes once a month. The differences in how those infants perceive the world and process information are obvious and clear and can be put on a graph that is really quite startling to look at. Those children do not pay special attention to human faces the way neurotypical children do. Autistic children pay equal attention to pretty much everything in the environment. The pattern on the carpet, the color of the walls, the noises outside the room, everything gets equal time. And human interaction is not especially interesting. They're constantly shifting their attention all over the place. And this is due to their neurological differences. We do not screen out information the way neurotypical people do. As a consequence, it's often quite an overwhelming experience to be inside the autistic mind, and this is what so many people in the field of psychology and medicine fail to recognize, because quite frankly they can't imagine it. Just as I can't imagine what it's like to have all those filters and be able to just ignore things that are not relevant to me right at the moment. I'm noticing all kinds of things, and once I've noticed them I can't unnotice them. You know, so the total effect of that is that I am frequently overstimulated. I may stim, rocking back and forth in order to help me stay grounded and focused and pay attention, and also to discharge some of the energy that's building up due to that overwhelm. You may see autistic people engaging in all kinds of repetitive movements. They may make grimaces. They may click their pens, tap their feet, rock back and forth, flap their hands, all kinds of behaviors that are intended to help soothe and relieve some of the tension And so I spent a great deal of my childhood being criticized for my primary stim, which was rocking. And if I'm sitting kicking my foot, you know, if I'm paying attention and trying not to do it, my foot is probably moving. It's almost impossible for me to sit still, which is why I'm doing this video standing up. It's actually easier for me to be more controlled and more still standing up. But I still move. And some people find that really annoying. When I was a kid, I was constantly being hounded about it. Sit still. Stop fidgeting. You know, I did my best, but I mostly failed. You know, and in school assemblies, I was required to sit on my hands so as not to distract my neighbors. That sort of thing. And it has quite an impact, and it makes it very, very difficult for the child with autism to concentrate and pay attention on just one thing. You know, movement of the body helps me to stay focused in space. Without that, I begin to feel rather like a disembodied consciousness floating around, not attached to anything, and just constantly having my attention pulled in 25 different directions. And if I'm under fluorescent lights for any length of time, really an hour or more, I will become very, very anxious and tense, and it gets more and more difficult to focus. In fact, I'm in survival mode at that point, and I have to employ a number of tactics and techniques to relax, to remember to breathe, to locate the tension in my body and deliberately release it. You know, that helps me stay focused. If I don't do that, I'm going to go into a state of complete overwhelm sooner or later, just from the lights. The lights alone will do it. If there's a lot of other sensory input coming in at the same time, I'm going to get overwhelmed even faster. You know, so I really have to work to manage that. Fortunately, there are really wonderful techniques that can be done very easily, very quietly, without anyone being even aware of it. You know, when I'm in a supermarket, I am constantly reminding myself to drop my jaw, lower my shoulders, breathe. Just breathe. And then I'm liable to put the little coat hanger smile on my face, because I learned one thing a long, long time ago. It is not possible to hold two emotional states at once, and the positive one will win every time. So if I deliberately plant a smile on my face, no matter how phony and fake it feels or looks, it's only a matter of seconds now before I actually start to feel better. And I begin thinking thoughts that amuse me, like, isn't it ridiculous that I have to do this in order to feel okay? And I wonder what the guy next to me is thinking. Is he noticing these things that I do to make myself feel better? You know, and that it amuses me that, you know, other people take it for granted that I should be relaxed, when in fact I feel pretty beat up after a half an hour in the supermarket, and it's difficult to describe or explain why that is, but there it is. You know, that is my constant common experience, and it is very, very common to all of us on the spectrum. We are just in a state of sensory overload all the time. You know, my daughter had a very, very difficult time with mornings. And this was before we knew that either one of us had Asperger's syndrome. What I did know was that mornings were positively traumatic for that child. And so I began modifying her environment to make it a little easier for her to cope in the morning, so that she would not be overwhelmed with anxiety before she even got out the door. And it meant she had to wake up to quiet music rather than an alarm blasting in her ear. It meant that her shades and curtains needed to be drawn for softer lighting. It meant that I could lay out her clothing and give her options, this or that. Which would you prefer? In the evening, and have that all ready to go for her at her convenience. And it meant that I could bring her a cup of tea with milk and sugar and her favorite cinnamon toast into her room in the mornings. And she could slowly wake up. She would sit up in her bed, with her blanket around her, a nice soft blanket, and she would sort of burrow into the cup and wait a little bit, and I'd see her rocking a little bit and sort of slowly pulling herself together with all the activity going on outside her room. She still had a safe place to gradually get accustomed to the noise, the lights, everything going on around her. You know, she could notice that everything was ready and waiting for her when she was ready, and nobody was pushing her, yelling at her, reminding her, nobody nagging her. She could have her 15 minutes to just sort of come fully awake and into the world, and the temperature change from the bed covers to the air wasn't so jarring. You know, she could transition at her own rate as she got accustomed to it. And that worked for her. That was all she needed to make mornings easy. Or easier. You know, most of us don't like getting up in the morning, and I'm sure she's no exception. You know, but for her, it really was a very, very challenging process. And without that safe space where it was okay for her to feel however she felt and just sort of gradually move into being awake and being up and, you know, making those transitions and doing what she needed to do on her schedule, that made life a lot easier for her. And she wasn't just falling apart at the seams within an hour and a half. She was ready to start the day. And of course, you know, the classroom environment is extremely challenging. But the point of it all is that when we're looking at the behaviors displayed by children on the autism spectrum, you know, we frequently all we see is the behavior. You know, we may draw a lot of inferences about that behavior, and we're likely to be dead wrong. The truth of the matter is that when you manage the sensory overwhelm, when you create a sense of safety and predictability and routine, when you make it okay for your kid to stim when he needs to do that because it helps him to feel better, when you create breaks during the day where it is not only possible, not only okay, you know, but absolutely encouraged that the child or the adult do whatever it is that makes them feel better, you know, and hit that reset button, everything changes, everything gets better. You know, there are 3 states that we typically live in on a chronic basis: fight, flight, and freeze. You know, and people don't realize that when the autistic child is just standing there staring at you and you think that they are not hearing what you're saying, they're in freeze. You know, there's so much overwhelm that they literally cannot process what you're saying. You're making mouth noises at them. The traffic is crawling to the central processing area, and there's a reason for that. There's a very good physiological reason for that. We can watch it happen on an MRI. When these kids are overstimulated, you'll see that all the blood flow is being directed toward the basal areas of the brain. It's not reaching this area up here where critical thought processes occur. It's just not getting there. Obviously, they can't respond. They can't formulate an answer. They can sometimes not even really interpret what you're saying. Now, for me, there's also, you know, a small amount of synesthesia playing in there, so that it gets very difficult for me to separate auditory and visual information when someone is talking to me. More likely than not, I am actually interpreting what they're saying. I'm translating it into a line of type that is scrolling across my mental screen, and I am literally reading what you say. Literally reading it, and I'm having to interpret again, you know, what do those words mean? For me, auditory processing can get really, really slow when I'm already in a state of overload. So it's critically important that I hit that reset button regularly. Now, I've learned how to do that in a matter of seconds under most circumstances. It's not as good as taking 20 minutes to just really do nothing and allow all those synapses to rewire. That takes about 20 minutes, but there are lots of quick, easy hacks that I also employ on a regular basis throughout the day so that I can process information more quickly, stay more focused, move from point A to point B to, without getting completely overwhelmed and just bogged down in details. That's what happens to us a lot of the time because everything is competing for our attention. We screen everything out and focus in on one tiny little thing and can't let go of it because that out there is just too much. So we really need to understand the behaviors that we're observing from the point of view of the autistic person. And because of that, I have 4 basic principles that Thriving with Asperger's revolves around at all times. We never lose sight of these 4 principles. One is that every behavior is a communication. Period. That's the only reason you're observing a behavior. Something is being communicated. The second point is that every behavior has an emotional state. Underneath of it, there is an emotional state that is being expressed. Every behavior is an attempt to solve a problem. It might be a really successful attempt and it might be a really unsuccessful attempt, but there is an attempt to solve a problem. And so when we're observing any behavior, we need to understand what that person is attempting to communicate, how they feel, and what it is that they're trying to solve. Because the fourth one is that every behavior has a positive intention, at the very least for the person engaging in the behavior. From their point of view, their intention is not to harm anyone else, even though their behavior could be quite destructive. That's not the intention. The intention is to feel better in some way, to solve a problem in some way. So when we approach all of the behaviors, all of the symptoms of Asperger's syndrome that we observe from that point of view, that every behavior is a communication, and it has a positive intention, an underlying emotional state that we can identify, and we can, and is an attempt to solve a problem, everything suddenly makes sense, and it becomes much, much easier to see a path to assisting that person in solving their problem more effectively. So when we understand that sensory overload is what's driving almost everything we see, that is the engine driving this train. If I didn't have all of that sensory input making me nuts, my behavior would be a lot calmer. I wouldn't have to rock back and forth all the time. I wouldn't exhibit symptoms of anxiety. I'd be calm. For me, I have to remind myself all the time, calm. Calm feels good. You know how to do that. That'll feel better. And that's all anybody really wants. Nobody's ever looking for perfection. We think we are, and we're sometimes holding ourselves to a ridiculous standard, looking for something called perfection, but that's not really what anybody wants. What we want is to feel better. And that's true for everyone. And it's possible for everyone. When we learn to accept a little bit better as a win, then it becomes easy to take the next step. And a little bit better, and a little bit better. And pretty soon, you're feeling downright good. It is a process. There is a formula involved. With Aspies, there's always a formula. Always. That's just how we do things. We like to be able to create certainty. Certainty is the one thing in our lives that we don't have very much of. And so creating certainty is a really big deal for us. So there is a program, there is a formula, there is a step-by-step plan. And at Thriving with Asperger's, that's what I do. I give you the step-by-step, I give you the formula, I give you the scripts, and together we work through how to resolve the things that are going wrong because of sensory overwhelm and because of misinterpretation and misunderstandings. We get all of that out of the way and we begin to resolve the difficulties and the conflicts one thing at a time. Just one. Only one thing at a time. When we do that, everything becomes easy. Everything becomes simple. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But it is an easy, simple, easily repeatable process that can be applied to almost anything, really. Everyone benefits from this. People on the autism spectrum are not really so very different from neurotypical people. It's more that we're more. We engage in stimming more. You do it too. You just don't do it as much. I've never met a person who never grimaces. I've never met a person who never clicks their pen or taps their foot or whatever it is that you do. Everybody does it. It's just that autistic people do it more. Why? Because we have more anxiety. Why do we have more anxiety? We're overwhelmed. It's really a very frightening place to be. When you don't feel like you have control over your experience, you're vulnerable. And you're living in a state of fight or flight. It might be low level, but it's there. For right now, the important thing is the 4 principles of thriving with Asperger's. They are the foundation for everything. They are the basis for every bit of the work that we do here. Every behavior is a communication. Every behavior is an attempt to solve a problem. Every behavior has an underlying emotional state that we can discover, and every behavior has a positive intention. And when we approach our loved ones with autism from that point of view, everything suddenly begins to make sense, and it becomes much, much easier to communicate and negotiate and interpret and understand and work together to create sustainable solutions that we can repeat and replicate and apply to virtually every area of our lives. And then eventually you get to the point where you really are using the 5-second hack on a regular basis, and it just comes naturally, and you don't have to fight and struggle for it anymore. It's really very simple when I'm in the supermarket to notice where the tension is in my body and deliberately pay attention to that and start relaxing it. And I don't have panic attacks anymore. I haven't had a panic attack in, I want to say, almost 30 years now, because I learned how to breathe. I learned how to breathe. I didn't know how to breathe. I wasn't breathing correctly. It's as simple as that. When we learn how to breathe, and when we learn to stop resisting the tension and move into it, the same way that we desensitize against other stimuli, they really do become quite easy to manage, when we understand how to help that person guide themselves into just relaxing and being with the unpleasant stimuli for a very short period of time. Just allow it to be there. That's a process that we teach people how to do for themselves all the time, regularly, until the unpleasant stimuli just doesn't bother them anymore. It's a question of knowing how and when to implement those strategies, and certainly we don't do that in the beginning. That comes a little further down the road. But, it does happen, and it's much easier to get your child to experiment with new foods, because I know that's an issue for a lot of you, when you know how to help them desensitize from the things that they're afraid of, from the things that bother and annoy them, and just, become the straw that broke the camel's back and sends them into shutdown or meltdown. They know what their triggers are, they just don't know why. So when we work together, to help the child or the adult with autism recognize their own triggers and understand what's happening within them and why it's happening, that they're not at fault, and that they haven't done something wrong, and they're not defective, but there are really simple strategies that they can use that will help them feel better. It's like the whole world opens up. Everything becomes possible. Is it easy? Well, no. Whose life is easy? Life isn't supposed to be easy. Where would the fun be? If you never wanted anything, if you never worked for anything, you'd just sit there like a lump in the corner and do nothing. Having a want is a really, really important part of being alive. And the first thing that everybody wants is to feel good and to feel safe. We know how to create that safety, and we can teach you how. This is Thriving with Asperger's, where we don't just survive on the spectrum, we thrive on the spectrum. Have a really great day, and come back and see us real soon.